I'm Sarah Burke, and this is the Women in Media podcast. When I launched the Women in Media Network a few months ago, I found myself contemplating the limitations of using the words women, woman, and female. But every time I thought too hard about it, I was reminded that my mission here at the Women in Media Network is to amplify underrepresented voices and to build a diverse network of creators. The network is meant to support storytelling from so many different perspectives, and I was thrilled to receive an email from the two creators who are my guests today, looking for a little support in launching their podcast. They are the hosts of a new podcast called Late in 88, which will explore the blurred lines of truth and memory as two grade school classmates share their experiences of growing up queer and gender non-conforming in Calgary, Alberta in 1988. A time when there really wasn't language to describe identities that were fringe or that you couldn't define. They're going to explore the impact of historical context and the gift of contemporary language that helps us talk about these things now. Well, who are the hosts, you ask? Bronwin Parks of award-winning agency Feisty Creative, and Elinor Svoboda, an award-winning filmmaker, sound designer, and educator. Bronwin, Elinor, thank you so much for being on the Women in Media podcast. How are we feeling? I feel like this is your first interview or press that you are doing on this project.
Excited. It's going to be good.
It's going to be good. I can obviously read the little description that we've come up with for your podcast, but let's start with who you both are and how you met. Elinor, I'm going to start with you.
Oh, dear. Okay. How we met. How we met is actually a lot of what the podcast is about. Well, should I introduce myself first?
Yes.
Because the Bronwin and I meeting part is a longer story. So my name's Elinor, as you said, and I'm a filmmaker, a Canadian filmmaker. I've worked in the industry for about 20 years, making short films and both fiction, documentary. I'm climbing up to making my first feature soon. And I've always worked in audio. That's been my side thing in the industry, and it's been amazing. I'm also an educator. I've taught it. And so actually it's kind of funny because I was wrapping up 7 years of teaching, and in one of my courses, the assignment is to teach the students to make a podcast. And Bronwin and I had, well, we'll get to how we met, but how we cooked up this project was the initial idea was for it to be a film. And I was wrapping up this course with these students with this podcast project. And I thought, I want to make why am I not doing this? I know how to do this.
Course, by the way?
At Sheridan College in Oakville.
See, this is so funny because I just wrapped up teaching a podcasting course at Western. We should probably collaborate.
Yeah, exactly. So I pitched the idea to Bronwin, and they were like, yeah. And so that was kind of how this iteration of the project began. Okay. But yes, we have known each other since we were 5, right, Bronwin? 5?
Yeah. Okay. But let's get Bronwin's background, and then we'll dive into
I know. Yeah. Let's do that part.
Yeah. I'm Bronwin Parks. My pronouns are they, them, and I would probably be best described as a heroically foul-mouthed creative director within my award-winning studio, Feisty Creative, and we work primarily in the music, film, television, and digital media industries. And yeah, Elinor and I have actually kind of grew up together. We've known each other for a very, very long time. But the funniest part is we went to school together for 13 years, but we weren't really friends, which is kind of interesting given that as time went on, we really realized we had a whole lot in common, which is kind of how this whole process got going.
Okay, what was the first conversation between you two? Was it over food? Was it over coffee?
It was on a Facebook high school reunion page, actually. Yeah. And this story did not make it into the podcast. We thought it would, but basically this Facebook high school reunion page came on, which I don't know if any of you out there have those, but they're horrifying and fascinating and bring up all sorts of feels, especially when you live far away from the actual reunion, you're not in person. And so I was doing my lurking scrolling thing, and Bronwin had posted, and I was like, oh, Bronwin Parks. And when I saw their post and all their awesome stuff about being a queer cowboy and in the music industry, I was like, cool. And then I had this total flashback to a moment that we shared when we were younger. And I do talk about it in the podcast, but it was like this. I just was like, yeah, there was always something interesting going on there. Bronwin Parks. So I just on impulse sent them a PM and said like, hey, if you're ever in Toronto, like we should grab a coffee. And it was really cool because they followed up and we did. Mm-hmm. And I don't know if you want to take it from here, Bronwin.
Yes, please.
Yeah. It was hilarious because like there were so many like almost like ships passing in the night situations where, like just various experiences. It's like, wow, like we had so much in common. And yeah, I mean, it's funny because like the high school reunion page was mainly because like our year couldn't get ourselves organized to do a real in life person reunion.
I think a few people met at a bar. I think
they might have. Yeah.
Okay.
But the Facebook page did what it needed to do, right? You just want to see like, is my spouse prettier than yours? Am I more successful than you? Just the usual. And that type of thing. But I don't know, it was really cool to see everybody. And then, yeah, when I saw Elinor reach out, I was like, oh my God, yeah. Like, let's go for coffee. 'Cause there are very few people that you would know in life for like that period of time, like the whole period of going to school. Yeah. Like it's a very sort of in Calgary when we were in the French immersion program, and so you kind of go to like 3 very specific schools. So unlike other sort of like school life, you might sort of at certain stages like break off at junior high or high school or whatever, but like because we were this French cohort that went straight through from elementary all the way to high school, there was really like a core group of us that kind of like went through the entire era together. So it was really cool to like meet up again as adults.
So now like coming into, the podcast being born, I love this like part of the description that we just added, and I'm going to read it word for word because we just put it in email yesterday. And it is by shining a light on their middle childhood, Bronwin and Elinor. I'm going to say that again.
It's fine.
I know. I'm feeling terrible. I'm like,
document it, Sarah. Do I have a practice session here on the podcast? I'm teasing you. It's fine.
It's okay.
You can just say Ellie.
Just say Ellie.
It's fine.
So we just added this part of the description to the podcast yesterday. And I just think it's like, really what's at the core of everything. By shining a light on their middle childhood, Bronwin and Elinor expect the impact of historical context and the gift of contemporary language to allow more freedom of self-expression. So obviously there's a very specific audience that you have in mind for this podcast, but also there's an education piece. So I would love to hear some reflections on, putting those two things together.
Yeah, it's really interesting. Like one of the things we noticed as we talked more is like, obviously I'm non-binary, and like thinking about how like if the terminology and sort of like the modern language we have around gender and sexuality had existed way back then in 1988, I am very much sure that like from that age I would have identified as such, because I always felt like I lived in that liminal space between gender. Like I kind of sifted out as a tomboy because that was the only language we had at the time.
Yeah,
it was like all we had really. And but yeah, so it's been really interesting through the podcast to explore that, like what do you experience in middle childhood, which is an area that like a lot of people don't talk about. You talk about early childhood or like prepubescent teens, but like there is that sort of like little area where actually a lot of development happens as far as the child as an individual. And it's been really great to interview child psychologists and curriculum studies professors to sort of really see like what did we have available at the time, and like how have things changed over the last like 35 years or whatever,
or haven't changed,
or haven't, as it turns out, or haven't.
Yeah, it was interesting because we didn't necessarily set out to make this project about middle childhood. But when Bronwin and I connected and they had come out as non-binary, we just started to have all these conversations about gender identity and queerness because it was something that we both related on. Now, I I identify as gender fluid, but I haven't changed my pronouns or anything. And that's my own journey that I'm on, because I didn't know that that was a journey until like a few years ago. Right?
Again, language, right?
And that was part of that was a part of our connection, where I was like, oh, I spent my 20s calling myself androgynous. Like I didn't know how else to say it. Right.
Yeah.
And by the time I got to this point, I had settled into, okay, this is my version of female. Right. But when we were talking about this journey, both of us kept coming back to grade 4. Like there was something about grade 4 specifically that we both kept saying, yeah. And then in grade, it was all good. And we were hanging out with the boys and we were doing this and we were doing that. And then boom, grade 4. And so that's how the middle childhood piece shaped out for us, was somehow we were like, what is it about this age? Right. And so we went after it just with our curiosity and our own fuzzy memory, because part of it too is like, am I remembering this right? Or is it from this age? And you know, some of it will be blurred because you can't always know. But that was kind of how we landed on that. And then it just has taken us on such an amazing journey to the learning, and then also just our own personal growth around like what got set in at that time, like what actually like got set in, and some of it's still there. You know,
the fuzziness piece is really interesting. I remember when I was speaking to Tegan and Sarah about like the book and, you know, them diving back into their sort of, I guess, middle childhood as well, in a sense, but there was a lot of high school in, I think, the memoir. Again, like with memories, like Tegan would say one thing and Sarah would be like, I don't remember it like that at all. Right. Like there's this perspective that both of you will bring to this podcast. That's really interesting. Was there, a point that really became clear as like the start of the podcast? Like, was there a story that became the core?
I don't know if there was a specific story, but there was just sort of, I mean, there's Elinor's memory from sort of like the tire swing incident.
Don't feel like you have to give it away. You got to listen to the pod.
Yeah, but
I know. I'm like, we're trying to.
That is the memory that inspired me to reach out to Bron. I mean, I can say it. Like,
okay.
You can decide if you want if you want to use it or not.
Yeah, the first taste is free.
There you go.
But yeah, like, so when I had seen Bronwin on the Facebook page, the memory that had come forward for me was us at the tire swing around these ages. And I was waiting to play on the tire swing and Bronwin was there. And, you know, we get into this in episode 1. Bronwin was pretty intimidating, right? Kind of had a little bit of a rep. Yeah. And I was a bit skittish, right? So I was a little bit like, oh God, how's this going to go? But I really want to play on the tire swing. So I'm just going to wait. and you know, these are the moments, the little big moments, right? And then finally Bronwin stopped, got off the tire swing, and we exchanged a look. And the reason it stuck with me was because we looked at each other and I saw that, like, I looked in their eyes and was like, oh, you actually seem like a really nice person. And it was, I think for me conceptually, like a moment of like, what everybody says about this person might not be true. Which, if you think about it around those ages, is like, that's a developmental learning, right? This idea of like how you're experiencing something versus how your social group is experiencing it. And it always stuck with me. Like it was like a formative moment. So coming back to the relationship as an adult, I was like, I want to find out what I saw in that moment. And that was kind of the start of the podcast, was us saying, hey, like, let's go back and piece this puzzle together. And where were you and where was I? And part of what was so fascinating was realizing we were in the same rooms, we were in the same classrooms, we were at the same birthday parties, we were doing the same stuff at recess, like so much intersection. And yet there was never a connection. And maybe the reason there wasn't a connection is because we were so alike. Like we both were these tomboys. We both were kind of not quite fitting in and trying to find our way. And so that was how the question of the podcast, which was born, which was, what if we would have been friends? Would it have made a difference for us at that time, in that stage, if we would have had each other?
And even like, you know, figuring yourselves out aside, just assumptions, right? In childhood, assumptions that we make about anything, about another kid in school. it sounds like there's just there's so many different layers to this. So that's cool.
Mhm.
And Bronwin, do you remember that moment or any first impressions of Elinor? Because I feel like we just got that side, but I want to hear your side.
That part's in the podcast.
That part's in the podcast.
Bronwin being like,
Fine,
no.
fine.
Yeah, we're gonna say that. No, yeah, like it's funny because my memories of that era, like I was in such a weird space. Like the boys started acting differently. Like even though we'd all been like a really core group of guys and me, like guys started to act differently towards me, and there was like a really poignant moment in like, you know, this is the first year you have health class, right? Like where you start.
I was bright red for the entire. So bad.
Yeah, so like, you know, that's you know, another sort of like key moment. And one of the fascinating things is like, so we had grade 4 in 1988, and it actually turns out that a whole lot happened in Calgary in 1988. So obviously this whole thing happens in front of the like world spectacle of the 1988 Olympics. You know, later that year, like the Calgary Flames won the Stanley Cup for like either the first time or the first time in many years.
An epicenter.
I know. And then also, most importantly, 1988 was the very first year of like, you know, any form of like pride event. So it was kind of the very first Calgary Pride event happened in 1988. It was like a nice small sort of like picnic in the park scenario. So like, even though like we kind of landed on this, like there was like all of a sudden more and more, the more we dug in, there was just so many things that happened that year as well. So we kind of discuss a whole bunch of it throughout.
That's so cool. So what would you say, and I would love an answer from both of you, what would you say is, you know, the takeaway that you're looking for someone who listens to leave with?
Ooh, good question.
Yeah. I mean, I think it's just really important to like, you know, when kids are younger, there's often like adults are like, well, we know better because we have the lived experience and stuff like that. But I think there's like an innocence of a child at that age where they're not necessarily like, you know, societies, it doesn't have as much as a broader impact. I mean, there's sort of the nature nurture discussion, and obviously the kid would need to feel really safe in their home environment. But I think that it would be really great if even just, you know, like young families, like listen to your kids when they talk to you, you know, like they know themselves, and like don't necessarily try and force them into a bucket just because you think that's what it should be, and allow them to find their own authenticity and self-expression in that way. And also like we want people to sort of learn more. I think it's really important that we keep so often queer history has been erased and actively suppressed in a lot of ways. And so one of the things, like when we talked to Kevin Allen, Calgary gay historian, he was such a wealth of knowledge, and he has done incredible things around like keeping our queer stories alive, you know, and I think it's important to remember how far we've come, while simultaneously in some ways kind of sliding backwards. But I think
that how much work there still is to do. Yeah,
exactly. But one of the great things is that we have today that we didn't have yesterday is like, you know, queer elders, which is a moniker I take on very proudly, and with great gratitude. We have more freedoms today than queer elders did when we were 8, right? Like, you know, even though, like there's a lot of things going on in, you know, having politicians debate our humanity, and restrict our access to healthcare and whatnot, which is not just limited to the queer community. Obviously, they're coming after women as well, like general cis women. So I think, you know, it's just, we today, like I can't necessarily be fired or unhoused for being queer or trans, and so it puts us in a more of a position of power to fight back against some of these, you know, policies and regulations that are looking to harm us in other ways.
No, I think that makes so much sense. Okay, Elinor.
Yeah, I mean, absolutely everything Bronwin said, and I'll talk about the other side of it, maybe, which would be, I would love for the listener to have their own journey with their inner 8-year-old. I really feel that there's a lot here for anyone who's been 8, which is everyone. Unless you're under 8, which it's not really appropriate because they're swearing and stuff. But yeah, I mean, I'll speak for myself. I went through such a profound healing journey with this. I really did.
Beautiful.
And I just didn't know how much had been bottled up at age 8. I really didn't. So my hope is that folks who are listening will identify themselves in there, maybe have their own connection with that part of themselves, find some self-acceptance, think about what did they do to belong, how did they feel in their sexuality and their gender identity, all of those pieces, because I feel no matter where you are on any spectrum, like there's opportunity for exploration. And at these ripe ages, these young ages where we're just coming into who am I, where do I belong in society, there's just so much there to recapture of the authentic self. So that's really what I would hope for the listeners who tune into this to experience.
It is very interesting when I think back to my middle childhood, because without even knowing, it is a part of my childhood I don't engage with a lot in memory. I can tell you that during that time, I was not popular. I had a lot of there was a lot of bullying around. And it's funny because something you said earlier really resonated. There's a group chat going on right now with my public school, the girls I really was tight with, growing up at this age we're talking about. And I've only really had communication on a somewhat regular basis with one of them. So the idea of coming together for a meal, which is what's being proposed, I'm will I just digress and revert back to this person I was when I'm it's so wild to think about who you were at that time. And only a few of them were in my high school, but we weren't friends. So again, there was a connection, but we weren't around each other a lot. And then even with exploring sexuality or gender, I'm thinking there was a time where I was dressing in boys' clothes and called myself a tomboy. I remember when we would dress up as, call it pop stars or whatever for a talent show. I was AJ from the Backstreet Boys.
Nice.
Yeah, fair.
Nice. Yeah. Right. And I'm thinking about that now, and I'm like, that is so interesting. And then also with just body stuff and health class. I remember feeling like there was a spotlight following me around at school during this time. Yeah. So uncomfortable. Sure, whether it's developing boobs. I remember these girls snapped my bra. I was one of the first ones to wear a training bra. That must have been around age 9 or 10 or something. Mm-hmm. And I wrote in the group chat, if I show up and anyone snaps my bra, I will be leaving. It was a joke. It was a joke, but that's what I remember. Right?
Yeah.
So all of this is so fascinating also because the kids growing up today are being encouraged to explore. Whereas in our childhood, no, it was you're this or you're this, figure it out. Yeah. So I think this project is so cool. And, I also wanted to ask about, because you both fight a lot for systemic change, whether we're talking about, it's in our description we wrote, but whether it's in, a board you sit on or a project you're working on in your creative work. I would love to hear about your experience and challenges in fighting for those things.
Yeah, I guess for me, I always feel like it's sort of my duty to make it easier for those coming after us, because it's a constant sort of battle for equity, for, all these groups who have otherwise been sort of pushed to the margins, and we all live at kind of our own unique intersections of identity. And until we're all free, none of us are, because it all the oppression of one group will be used to oppress others. It's sort of and I think that for me, it's just given the how am I gonna put this now?
That's okay.
Given the sort of aggression that was that I faced in Alberta, and like the really like difficult environment that like it just was not a safe environment. I worked, I was a rodeo cowboy, and so I worked on a lot of ranches when I was younger, and like those were not safe spaces. Like I really had to be like on my toes and make sure like there were, this is a time like, and we're talking in the 90s, so like back, when I'm working and stuff, like there were guys on those ranches that believed in corrective rape and that type of thing, right? Where like they would threaten to sexually assault me to fix me, and that type of thing. So for me, like when I kind of broke out of that and I moved to Toronto and I like started my career in the music industry and that type of thing, I felt like I was now like, I guess I wasn't really afraid of anything at that point. Like I survived that. Like I was like, 14, 15, 16 years old, and these grown ass men were like threatening me, and I managed to like defend myself against them and like, move on and get away from that. I'm like, well, now I have to like use this strength for fighting for the sort of greater good in a sense. And like, I don't think people really remember like when we were teenagers, like there were laws on the books where like the age of consent for queer sexual intimacy was actually 18. And so like they're like technically when I was messing around with one of my friends when I was 14, she could have technically been charged with like
even
statutory
though we were
rape.
all exploring those things at that time.
We're all figuring ourselves out, I'm like 15, 16 years old, but like my friend is 18 and she could have gotten big trouble for that. But meanwhile, if it was a heterosexual relationship, it would have been mostly okay. And so I think, and that's just within our lifetime. And for most of my life, it was not legal for me to marry my wife, for example. That's like that wasn't until the 2000s. Like that's not that long ago.
Right.
So I feel like it's great to see how far we've come. And I still think like we're a long way from like having our humanity debated in the House of Parliament. So like until it's no longer an issue, I mean, speaking to Elinor's kids and stuff, like the kids are all right. Like to hear the word transgender roll off her 8-year-old son's mouth, like it's just no thing, was like, it made my heart explode. And because it's like my mother still struggles with it, so it's like the kids are doing okay, which is great. So I'm going to continue to fight for them. I just think it's like, I don't know, it is definitely a passion.
Is changing the minds of adults.
That's really it. Like, because we're the decision makers right now, and so we got to make sure that like we're leaving the world a better place than we found it, is kind of the way I feel about it.
How about you navigating all of this, Elinor?
Oh my goodness. Wow. I mean, I definitely, as a young person, a young woman coming up in the film industry, was exposed to a lot of sexism as a director, as a filmmaker, and also as an audio technician. I worked on a lot of sets, was in a lot of vans with dudes who just assumed I didn't know what I was doing, would talk down to me, would throw me under the bus, that kind of thing.
Go get our coffee, that type of stuff.
Yeah, like it just... And then when I started teaching, actually, that gave me a real opportunity to flex that leadership muscle in terms of being visible, right? Visible as a female identified person in this industry. And then when I really started claiming my queer identity, that as well. And I got to see how, wow, that makes such a difference for people to know that, because there was no queer instructors at the university where I was teaching. So it was like, whoa, that was a big deal. And within the work itself, I have a lot of passion around representation and the power of representation, just because I did not have that as a kid. I grew up in a very strict family, religion, the whole thing. So I didn't have representation of queerness, of being, different kinds of love, of women in power, gender fluidity. Come on. Yeah. So as an artist myself, as a writer, director, to write those kinds of stories and to have those kinds of characters with meaningful plot lines who don't die at the end, or, all of that kind of stuff, that to me, that is, I feel like my secret power, my special power that I can really bring in. I feel this podcast in such a personal way, we're doing that as well. You know, really showing that, okay, if you don't give kids the language, if you don't give kids representation, here we are, like, it took, sure, like, here's our bumpy road, and yeah, we still figured it out. We're still queer. We're still, like, it all still happened. So, and if you would have given us the words and the context and some heroes, some examples, it actually would have saved a lot of suffering. Like, that's all it would have done, was alleviate confusion, suffering, isolation, because we still, you know, arrived at the same destination at, you know, 30 years later.
I was going to ask if you thought the path would be different if you had those things.
Oh my God. Like absolutely. And I feel like Bronwin and I have kind of a different trajectory on this, which I find really interesting in terms of just what it was like at home, what we had for representation. And so I feel like we're good examples of that, just because I only encountered homophobia at home. I didn't know anybody who was gay. And I didn't have any media representation. For me, it was like silence, right? So I had these feelings, and then is just confusion and grayness, and even when my first love was a woman and I'm in the relationship, it's like I had so much internalized confusion, homophobia. I didn't even know how to like act or be or do or articulate, right? It was just and that, you know, so there's a lot of repression there for me that kind of painted a lot of my journey to my own self-identification and liberation too, really. Like I really feel like that sense of peace and self-love around that part of myself.
So well put, Bronwin.
Yeah, well, it's true. Like Elinor and I did kind of, you know, we kind of talk a bit about how we feel like we were on opposite sides of the same canyon. So like for me at home, I was actually what we would call today, like I was actually allowed to socially transition at home. Like at home, I was just Bronwin. I played with boys' toys. I mostly identified in that, you know, like I didn't identify as either, to be completely honest. Like obviously, like I was put in the she her bucket because there were but two buckets, and genetically and biologically I was in one bucket. But at home it was like no big deal. And I was very fortunate. I have a queer uncle, and so like there was that representation with my family. Like there was just that was my Uncle Rob and my Uncle Dave, and my family is like super cool about it. And for me, I didn't start actually understanding that there was anything wrong with who I am. Well, and I say wrong like kind of in quotations, in that until I got out into the world. Like it was the world that told me I was wrong. Like my family, like despite everybody having, you know, you have complicated family life, ups and downs, but like this is actually one thing that they did absolutely right. And it's and at the time, like it's not that they were like trained different or anything, you know, we were a Christian household and stuff, but I was their kid and I was just this unique little weirdo, and lovable weirdo. And so like they were really, really cool about it. And so it wasn't until, I started to like in school and like, you know, out and about, or even like extended family, who like didn't quite understand what is this weird little tomboy situation happening. Like, so they would kind of try and force some more feminine things onto me, which my family like knew very clearly, like, that's not gonna fly, but sure, you can give her this like frilly dress for a present.
The
like,
frilly socks. Oh my God.
Or whatever. Like it's not gonna happen. Or like a Barbie. Barbie was like Barbie was only in relation to like He-Man and, and my Transformers. But like so it's just we had a very different like trajectory. And also I just felt like it was who I was. Like, I didn't know how to be anything else. And because it was like so accepted at home, I'm like, I don't understand why I need to like hide anything or change who I am. Like, this is just sort of like, I didn't understand why people thought I was weird or why people didn't like me or tried to change me. Right. Like when you're that young, like you don't understand, like, why is somebody, I told them no, like, why is no not a complete sentence, right? Like, why am I being forced into this, in a sense? So yeah, it was kind of interesting to see how, like in some ways, like Ellie's family was a bit more restrictive, and for me, like society was more restrictive. They didn't quite know how to like square this circle.
Yeah, and I feel like while we were discussing all this, and a lot of this comes through, I hope, in the podcast, we both realized, we probably represent a lot of people's experiences. Like I'm one thread of how things can go, and Bronwin's another thread of how things can go. And we both realized, like, that's really cool. There's value in that we can hopefully offer something to listeners that some people will maybe resonate a little bit more with Bronwin or with me, or maybe some of our classmates that we interview, who share some of their experiences too. And that's, I feel like what is so valuable about people sharing their personal experiences is that you can find yourself in them, like all the funny nuances and weird feelings. And like I said, at this young age, the weird, blurry, I don't know how to put words to it-ness of it.
Grayness again.
Yeah. But we really start to realize, wow, the difference in our experience is something really valuable, actually. I think.
Generations.
Yeah.
For sure. Okay, so are you guys good? Are you good for time? Because we're yeah. Okay. So I want to talk about the day you've chosen to launch the podcast, and there's a specific reason behind that. But first, if we could just touch on, Pride, because this release is coming during Pride. We were talking about how Pride is celebrated at different times in different places before we hit record. It was Victoria, I think that's July. I feel like, Bronwin, you said
Vancouver is August, and Montreal, I believe, is August. Calgary has also changed their Pride. I don't remember what the new date is, but
and Canmore, where I live now, is September.
Yeah,
so
very confusing.
Regardless, it's almost like I would say across international lines, June has a lot of weight when it comes to Pride. And I would just love to know, because I don't think that there's one answer in how to celebrate Pride and honor the things that Pride is to you. I would love to hear, from both of you and your personal experiences, what Pride is to you and what you hope comes from Pride whenever you're celebrating.
Do you want to go, Ellie?
Sure, yeah. Well, it's funny because as you go through, I think about my first Pride that I went to I found the photos. It was like 2002.
Late in 2002 is coming next.
And doesn't have the same ring to it.
Yeah, it does not. And it was in Vancouver, and it was with some friends and who were just newly coming out, and I was still figuring myself out. And I remember the feeling of joy around it, and kind of at the time, I remember there also being a tension in the air, and that dichotomy. And so over the years, it's been really interesting to watch the actual Pride celebrations evolve. And I've lived in many different cities, so I've had the opportunity to see how it's celebrated differently in different places, and then later on get to participate a bit more, like behind the scenes, helping friends out, with their booths or whatever it might be.
Yeah.
And then when I eventually became a parent, being able to bring my kids to Pride and see friends being grand marshals and things like that. So you have that evolution of your sense of community, but then it also is getting bigger and bigger and bigger. And so for me now, I guess I'm feeling a bit old. Like I may not go to the giant parade anymore, and where it's blistering hot in Toronto. But then what's kind of funny now that I've moved to a small town, I'm re-engaging with like the small community around Pride, and what can I offer here, and how can I participate here, because I feel myself coming from, offering the experience of my journey of coming out, seeing kind of a few generations of Pride. I don't necessarily relate anymore to the rah party part of it, and I love supporting the younger queer folks in my life who are at that stage, and they're sending me photos. And it's so beautiful just to have that, like, it's Pride time, because I don't feel like it was like that in my younger years necessarily, that kind of just like blowout fun times. And I feel like for us this year to be releasing this podcast during this time is so meaningful for me, to be able to start participating as a maker and a creator and start telling my story, which has been a pretty quiet story. Like it's been quiet for me. I've never been out and loud, and I've had mixed feelings about that over the years. There's been times I don't feel like I'm allowed to do that, or I'm not queer enough, or like those kinds of things. So it's been, I'm actually like emotional right now sharing that. It means a lot to me to be sharing something that feels really authentic during this time, and being able to contribute to all the different stories and all the different voices, and all the different ways of expressing that authentic queerness that are coming through more and more every year. Like I feel proud to be part of that. So, and I feel very proud to be with my badass collaborator Bronwin, who's such a power queer and has been such an amazing collaborator and friend, and has also been incredibly supportive of me as I've found my voice in this podcast around how to express myself in this area, really uplifting each other and helping each other to find our footing in this platform and share our stories. So
thank you for sharing that.
Yeah,
Bronwin,
thank you.
Over to you. Pride to you.
Oh my God. So here we go, folks. Like, get a tea, coffee, smoke them if you got them. It's going to be a minute. So yes, we're going to be releasing Late in 88 comes out on June 28th, which is a very specific day. So that is Stonewall Day, or Stonewall Pride Day. It is a day, I mean, obviously we celebrate the whole month of June, because you give queers an inch, we're going to take a mile and be fabulous about it. But yeah, so like at the end of June in New York City, there was the Stonewall riots, which is when the queer community, led by trans women of color, stood up against the New York City Police Department, against the harassment, against the abuse of power and the abuse on our community, and the targeted nature of the way they chose to police our community. Like, Pride was a riot to begin with, and I don't mean a party, I mean like a riot. We had enough, and that's another reason why I am so eternally grateful to our queer elders, like even those beyond our years, because they fought for us, like quite literally fought for us. They were imprisoned fighting for the freedom that we have today. And that's one of the things I always took with me to Pride. Like, yeah, it's a big party, you got DJs, you got lights, you got, glitter bombs and half naked everybody, I love it.
Great.
But I always attend Pride with that in my heart, that like these are rights that are like hard won, like people really sacrificed a lot and put in the work, like in so many different ways, through legislation, through, fighting with the government, fighting with the police, fighting with general, like, nowadays it's amazing to see the acceptance within the greater society. And I think that's something to really like remember, is that, when this whole thing started back in the late 60s, like society in general was policing us quite heavily, not just the actual police. But I think it's one of those things that, you know, when you live in a big city like Toronto or Montreal or Vancouver, like you sometimes forget what it's like for the baby gays out in the rural areas. I remember like, you know, I came out to my friend group when I was like 14, and I came out much more publicly when I was 16. And I took a trip to Toronto. I didn't even realize it was Pride weekend. I was just going to visit like some horsey friends and stuff. And I stayed with my uncle, and he's like, "Oh yeah, it's Pride this weekend." I'm like, "What? What?" Like, I had literally just come out to him, and he's like, "This is great. This is what a great Pride present for me. Like, my niece is queer." And and he was so excited. He went, and like every time we ran into one of his friends, he's like, "This is my niece and she's queer." And it was the cutest thing. Like, I'd never experienced somebody being proud. Like, I mean, my parents were not like difficult about me being queer. Like, they had their own things to wrestle with, but they're like, okay, like at the end of the day, they were kind of like, "We love you anyway." But like, my uncle was so like proud, and he was like parading me around the village in Toronto. And then I saw that weekend the Pride parade, and like I'm getting emotional now thinking about it, because like I stood on the side of Yonge Street and I was like bawling, like in like tears of like happiness, because I had literally never seen so many gay people in one place before, having like living so freely. Because I'd never even been to Calgary Pride, and for what I understood, like in the 90s, it wasn't much of a pride, like, because even when I participated in sort of Pride festivities in Calgary in the early 2000s and the late 90s, like it was kind of in like an elementary schoolyard on the weekend, and like the parade consisted about like, you know, 6 dykes on bikes and like a handful of pickup trucks with like, you know, queers in the back, which like was followed by just as many protesters, just as many rednecks in vans and trucks shouting obscenities at us and like all that kind of stuff. So like when I was 16 and I saw that Pride in Toronto, like it blew my tiny fucking mind. And I knew that was something that I needed to be a part of as I grew up. And so, you know, moving to Toronto eventually, I went to Pride, and I had some friends who were working for Pride, and I ended up actually volunteering and working with Pride Toronto for the better part of 6.5 years to like
right in.
Yeah. So like I don't mess around, you know, like I'm like, if something needs to be done, I just get in and do it, like, or get in to help, right? I'm not just going to sit there on the sidelines and complain about like, oh, this could be done better, that could be done better. It's like, well, why don't I go in and put my boots where my mouth is, in a sense, in a good way, not like my foot in my mouth, but like, let's put some boots on the ground.
Before we get off this this recording, I want to hear about your big announcement from this week too. But yes, please continue.
So it's like, it's really, I think it's important for folks to be out there and be visible for those baby gays coming in from the country, these little like dirt road bumpkin gays that like they have only a couple days where they can come in and like really be themselves. Like they might have even had to like come in with like separate bags. Like there's a bag of clothes that they wore leaving the farm, and then they have their fabulous gay clothes that they, you know, like bring in with them. And it's the reason I think that like having a gay village, sort of like Toronto's gay village is slowly losing its culture, but like having those hubs is so important to know. Like when I first walked down Yonge Street and then to like Church Street in Toronto, like it's like you can just breathe easier. Like it's like I am around my people, you know, like I feel safe. Like I literally knew nobody, well, except maybe my uncle, but like I knew nobody there, but I still felt so much safer than in my group of friends back in Calgary. Right?
Yeah.
And I think that's really important, especially as we see what's happening with legislation and, you know, like these many steps backwards that we seem to be taking as a society, that like we as a community are so strong together. and that's the most important part, is like being amongst friends, all your queer friends, no matter where you fit under the rainbow alphabet, as it were.
Thank you for sharing as well. I could talk to both of you for many hours. Honestly, yes. I'm like, oh God, I don't want this interview to end.
This will be like an epic 2-hour session.
Now you appreciate how much there was to edit from the podcast. So if you're listening to it out there, you're like, oh, 20 minutes. It's like, no, these conversations.
You're both so well spoken, and you both have, so much experience in many areas that you've brought to this project that, like, it's not a lot of editorial here, I don't think.
Cool. Compliment.
So,
thank you.
Compliment.
Except for my dog who's snoring again.
If at any point during this recording I was not able to remove a little sound that kind of sounds like a muffled fan, it's actually Eleanor's dog's snoring. No, I just want to say, like, congratulations on the project. I know it's never easy starting a podcast, and you have both approached this with so much love and conviction in what you're doing. And I'm just honored that you brought it to me for a little bit of help. So thank you.
Oh, well, thank you for like joining the team and championing us on your network. It's an honor to have such a pro on the team. And for all your help, it's been priceless. Thank you.
Oh, so to find out more about Bronwin, to find out more about Elinor, you can look in the show notes. I've got the link to the trailer for their podcast, Late in 88. You're going to follow. You're going to subscribe. The art is beautiful. The stories being told are beautiful. And I'm so excited to see what comes out of this project. Big congrats to you guys, and thanks for coming on the podcast.
Thanks so much, Sarah.